Okay, it's a pleasure to be invited to say a few words to you all. I admire what you all are doing, and I'm very glad to be a small part of it. I think of designers as being in the business, in your case at least, of trying to shift the status quo. And that's hard, and I think you probably all understand that. But I've studied one of the biggest shifts in the status quo that ever occurred in history, I think, and I think it affords some lessons that could be useful to you all. And I want you to tell me if you're having trouble hearing me. I'll assume you can hear me otherwise. So if you go back 100 years, 1915, American city streets, the idea about what a city street was for was totally different. The street itself looked a lot like a city street today, but people's ideas about what a street was for was totally different. And if people who wanted to sell cars had just tried to sell them anyway without changing people's mental infrastructure, so to speak, it would not have worked. And in fact, they tried to do it and it didn't work. Because 100 years ago, people's idea about a city street was that it was a place for everybody. It was a place where pedestrians had a complete right to be at any time, in any place. In almost all American cities, there were street railways, and they always went in the center of the street. And that meant that pedestrians, to board them or to get off of them, had to walk right into the street. So this meant that streets really were for pedestrians. And in fact, the official rules, the judges, the common law defended pedestrians' right to the street. And you start to really see this mental model of the street becoming striking when a lot of cars started to enter the street. And nobody was saying, how do we get people out of the street so that cars can drive wherever they want? People were saying, how do we get rid of these cars or slow them down? And at first, even the people who wanted to sell cars went along with this. They were saying, we have to go slower or people will resent us and fight us. And they wanted the cars to be accepted, so they tried to get drivers to slow down. But in 1923, people who wanted to sell cars figured out that they had to really transform the whole idea about what a city street is for. And the reason was that in lots of American cities, people were demanding very strict restrictions on automobiles. Things like mechanical speed governors. Is someone trying to speak to me?
No,
okay.
It seems like there's interference on the signal. Somebody's tapping
okay.
into it.
I will ignore that.
It's just
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go on. So, in 1923, there were proposals to restrict cars and make it impossible for them to go more than 25 miles an hour, and that really terrified people who wanted to sell cars because they thought their speed was the thing that made them most attractive to purchasers. So they actually sat down and they said, we have to change the conception that people have about what a city street is for. An incredibly ambitious idea. They went to work at it and they were remarkably successful. There's a lot of strategies that they used, things like taking over school safety education, and teaching children that streets are for cars. And I think reaching children is huge because they're obviously the future. They taught pedestrians that if they walked where they want, they were doing something shameful, which they called jaywalking. And they went to work to get gasoline taxes to pay for roads, because if gasoline pays for roads, then roads must be for cars. Now, I think I have time for only maybe one lesson from this experience for you. It would be the following. To change the present, you've got to change the stories we hear about the past and the stories and the vision we have for the future. So the story we now have, especially in America, because they preferred, and that's a story that is part true, but it's also concealing a lot of history. And to this day, the automobile industry is telling Americans that we built American cities for cars because that's what we prefer. We also need a vision of the future, and that's where General Motors' 1939 Futurama model is the extraordinary case. If they had had access to software like we have today, they might have made a virtual vision of the future, but instead they made a physical model that millions saw. And so they changed the story about the past, and they gave us a vision of the future, and that shifted the direction of the status quo. And there's a lot you could say about how they did it, but time won't permit that now. But they were successful, and I think you as designers can succeed as well if you learn from that example. So I think I've taken 10 minutes, so I'll conclude there.
Thank you, Peter. What would be sort of the one big lesson, I guess, when you look and you see how the car system was able to overcome all these mental challenges, redefine everything? I mean, what is the one single lesson that post-carbon proponents could learn to install or create a new system?
Yeah, I have to make a short list of big lessons instead of one. And the short list is it can be done. They did it. The second is people think of the status quo as a point on a trajectory. And if you want to know what a trajectory is, you have to know at least 2 points to define a trajectory, right? And so a trajectory in time, to make the status quo fit that trajectory, you have to tell a story about the past that makes that trajectory what you want it to be. And that in turn will shift the trajectory into the future. So what I would suggest to designers is recover the past that you've lost because we grew up hearing that people prefer to drive. And it turns out that if you look in the past at what people were actually saying, they were actually saying, streets are for people, and we need to recover that lost history where people were saying that streets are for people and not for cars.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Let's see if there's any questions.
Yeah, Peter, we also have our designers here and actually some local experts from Vienna who are very happy to hear you today. So is there any other questions?
If you're wondering too, it's about 100 degrees here. So everybody is sweltering.
Oh my.
No, great. I think this is a great start. What this really ties in with is we've had several speakers today talk about the mental shift, that so much of it has to do not with a technical challenge, an engineering problem, but much more with a mindset.
Yes.
And that's what you're saying too, is that's what the car system motordom maybe realized was change the mindset and everything follows.
Yes, and in fact, this term motordom is significant because it was used by people who wanted cities to be rebuilt for cars, and they got together and actually met like you are meeting right now, beginning in 1923, and started to ask, how do we do this? Maybe I can offer you one more lesson that comes from their case,
yes,
which is they said, we have to reframe what this debate is about. And they started to give the message that cars are the mobility mode of freedom, right? Which is a very attractive word, especially in this country. And if you can associate your vision with a theme of that kind, it can make a very big difference.
In your mind, maybe what could the post-carbon transport paradigm, I don't know what it would be called, motordom is such a nice word, but what if they use freedom to reframe the argument? What could that be?
I have a suggestion. I mean, one possibility is you could say that you offer real freedom, because once you make a city for cars, you can't get around in other ways very easily. And I think a post-carbon future is one of choices. Choices like walking, choices like bicycling, choices like transit. But maybe we need to get away from this freedom notion. And if that's the case, I would suggest that this post-carbon future is a future where you're not interested so much in moving vehicles for the sake of moving vehicles. You want a city that's for people, it's for places rather than for means of travel, and it's for the planet. And I think people, places, and planet, it's a nice alliteration in English at least, and might make a useful theme for a post-carbon urban future.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much,
Of course.
Peter.
Thank you.
Let's give him
Of course.
a hand.